I'm going to introduce Roy Massengill. And Roy began his environmental experience as a staff member with Team Environmental Services. At Team, he became the lead technical support person for what at the time was the largest fugitive emission monitoring company. In 1999, Roy started NRUD Resources to focus on technology approach to automating LDAR, leak detection and repair data management. In the early 2000s, NRUD was the provider of the leak tracker system, the first data logging system connected to monitoring instrument providing time and date stamps for monitoring events. As technology progressed, NRUD developed the first Bluetooth wireless connection to the monitoring instrument, both transmitter and receiver. Technology progressed, and eventually these hardware capabilities were contained in data loggers and monitoring instruments. NRUD has been in the service sector since 2005, providing audits, OGI, optical gas imaging, GHG, and traditional method 21 inspections for upstream and midstream. NRUD precedes stack testing, IR camera programs, marine vessel loading, fence line monitoring, LDAR programs, LDAR consulting, audit and training services. I want Roy to talk about what's happening on the mid and upstream side. I know we have a lot of LDC people, but there's a lot of integration across, and just kind of how DOT and EPA are kind of overlapping in a lot of areas as well. So with that, I'll let Roy.
Thank you. Okay. I'll be giving a talk on regulations and then trying not to make it too dry. Be going over 6 or 7 regulations. Each one of those could be a 50-minute talk or a 2-hour training, which I give, right? So I boiled that down, threw them all together, stirred it up, and we're going to see how it turns out. It's more informational, right? I'm going to slant it towards what I call a philosophical goal, is that the trend is empirical data. IRA, any of the GHG is gathering empirical data. The tools that you're going to see here, have seen yesterday and today, will help us gather that empirical data. So that's sort of the whole slant of it, introduce you to some rules and what I see coming from the EPA side and the state regulatory side. One of the things I want to talk about is just some things that happened recently, philosophically. Okay, it's happening. The LNG moratorium. I mean, what is happening? We're so polarized. Yesterday, Colorado, 2 senators in Colorado introduced a bill to basically ban oil and gas drilling. I mean, that's happening, right? It probably won't pass, but that's Colorado. So we have all this stuff going on where oil and gas, is the enemy, right? The narrative that is set. So one of the things we have to do, and I heard a speaker talk yesterday about transition versus evolving, that type of language. I read an article a couple of days ago by BCG. As we start to try to set the narrative and show, I'll say the population that we do care about things, the consulting company BCG wrote an article was, instead of talking about beyond net zero, talk about nature positive. So there's some things we can do as we set and discuss things to minimize the fear and what's going on out there. So that's sort of the philosophical thing that I think needs to be done. Like I said, I'll be talking about the federal rules and tie in from the EPA and the state. Quad OA has been around for a while. Quad OB and EG Quad OC, these are upstream, midstream rules. Basically the OGI camera. Also, Part 63 proposed, actually it's been about 1.5 years, gasoline distribution technology, RTR. It's another rule handling the terminals and things like that. Diesel, it used to be just the crude products. Now they're going towards products, diesel, gasoline, and things like that. This has not been promulgated yet. It is proposed. It's been through comments, and comments been extended for a 1.5 years. The move is to get away from method 21 in using and embracing technology. So we recently inside the Quad OA, Quad OB, EG Quad OC, we have Appendix K, which is a true EPA method for using an OGI camera. The API and the refineries have been lauding this for years, trying to be able to use the OGI camera as opposed to the labor-intensive method 21. They never really had a way to do that because we're outside of what we'll call, where y'all are, mostly alkanes. They have all sorts of enes and ines and different products to the distillation of the crude oil. So it's a little harder to get there. Response factors, will it see it, as even thinking about using it into the chemical industry. So the OGI was really implemented down or upstream in distribution first. Then I'll be tying in GHG, subpart W, waste minimization rule, and the IRA, just showing the Venn diagram how these are actually working together and actually manifesting what we're seeing now, rule development. I won't touch on state rules too much. I had this vision of what I was going to do and just not going to have time. Just know that the states have their own set of rules that are usually a little more rigorous or a little different than the federal rules. I'll begin with the legacy rule, Quad OA, and after that came, it just got promulgated. It's not in the Federal Register yet, but Quad OB and EG Quad OC. Quad OA was midstream, upstream OGI program and controlling different sources. Quad OB just got a little more stricter, and then it tied in EG Quad OC, which basically, these are NSPS rules, which had a grandfather after a certain date you were applicable. EG Quad OC takes it through the state SIP. There will be no grandfather. So in about 5 years, the states have to submit their SIP program, and it has to be equal or more stringent than Quad OB. And so every oil and gas well pad, compressor station will be under some type of continuous monitoring or inspection program in about 5 years. There's some definitions we won't get into deep. I know the audience, but they're in addition to compressor stations, centralized production facilities. They changed the definition of what a fugitive emission component is. Basically, anything that has a potential to emit, where there were some gray areas in previous rules. They have different types of categories for what is applicable. We're going to begin with the reciprocating compressors, because that is some of the technology that ties in with this conference. The comparisons, the previous rules, we really didn't have to do anything but replace rod packings. As we go to Quad OB and Quad OC, we're going to have to use the high flow sampler, basically, or a mass device that will determine mass annually at a certain level, 2 standard cubic feet per hour. If you pop that level, you're going to have to replace the rod packings. So we switched from what we call an equipment standard to a work practice standard. And that would be an inspection, and then if it's above a certain level, you have to replace it. Applicability and the dates. Remember, these are new source performance standards. So if you were before 2011, or right after 2011, you were under Quad OA. If you were between 2011 and I think 2015, that's when you're after Quad OA. And then if you're after December of 22, you're going to be applicable to Quad OB. That's as far as the applicability for compressors. One of the things they brought into this rule, y'all are familiar with the GHG program where we had to test rod packing vents, et cetera. You just went out there, implemented put a device like the high flow sampler or other device on there, just put it on there reading, waiting for it to stabilize, write down a number, and you just report it. Well, as we codified this in with Quad OB, they actually have a test method, okay? It's 86B here, and it gives you procedures. You have to write a compliance plan or a monitoring plan. That monitoring plan has to have certain criteria on the operation of the high flow sampler. So it just got a little more stringent on how to operate it, and that's one of the things that really makes the Semtech device really good, is they're setting that into their software such that that is automated, so that way you'll be gathering good data, whereas in the past we've had to set up our SOPs just on paper, say check this box, fill in this blank, to make sure that we had some compliant data. There's also, much like some of the Appendix P and some other things, there's some periodic requirements for calibration and verification. Flow meters have to be checked annually, and you have to perform some linearity checks to make sure the instrument's operating properly. These are, once again, making it a more rigorous EPA method as opposed to going out there and winging it. So these are all codified. Semtech, and there's several others, but the Semtech device as we're working with the different people, and they'll be going over that. Inside their initiation of a test, they have some of these things built into it, which is what we want from a software standpoint. As we go away from the reciprocating compressors, next thing we have fusion emission components, what everything revolves around out there, really, the most rigorous part of the EPA program. Upstream, we have effective facility use monitor, basically all the fusion emission components on a periodic basis. Previously, it was semi-annual for oil and gas facilities. It's going to be going to quarterly. That's the biggest thing. And they separated into 4 different types of well sites and compressor stations, and vary the frequency based on what size or your potential to emit. Here's the frequency. So the biggest thing you'll notice, if you're somewhat familiar with that, is that well pads were done semi-annually in the past since about 2015, at least at the federal level. They're now going to be quarterly. And they implemented a AVO program based on certain frequencies, based on what type of facility you are. We never had a required codified visual program, okay? And they actually have that in a record keeping and reporting. So in addition to what you may hire a OGI group to do, and maybe a contractor, it makes sense for site people to do the OGI program, which requires some type of software where you can at least document they showed up, GPS coordinates, et cetera, et cetera. There is some record keeping and reporting requirements, which means we're going to have to find a way to do that, as opposed to in the past in Method 21, it could just be a log saying you did it. There's going to be a little more rigorous requirements, date, time, GPS coordinates. Repair requirements. We have a repair requirement for an AVO and an instrument inspection. A little bit longer than traditional Method 21 programs, which was a 5-day first attempt, 15 repair. We still got 30 days. And so the main thing, there is some criteria for repair, like most rules. And you can put things on shutdown, and the biggest change is you have to be able to repair that within 2 years. So you can't just leave it on there forever, which sometimes industry has done in the past. So that's the biggest change. The other thing that is really a paradigm shift, as they're trying to codify the ability to use advanced technologies, is in addition to OGI, Method 21, you're allowed to implement alternative procedures, which they actually give as long as you meet this criteria and you're approved by the EPA. If you meet this criteria, you can either use a periodic screening, which is flyovers. Hadn't really thought about it for the vehicle, but it's really, as I read it in the past, it's more designed for the aerial fixed wing and even possibly satellites, if you can meet that criteria. Going deep into that's a little beyond what we can do here. Just know that is some of the options that they're allowing. It's codified upstream, which is a total shift, the ability to embrace new technologies. We also have continuous monitoring, which is area sensors placed around with a MET station. As long as you meet certain criteria, you can use those, and then you only have to respond when you have an alarm. So that is one of the biggest changes. I mean, if you think about it, now we're codifying, whereas in the past, you couldn't use new technology because it was not an accepted method. Now we're codifying the ability, if you meet these criteria, you can now use that. Another big thing is BESR for LDAR has always been Best Systems of Emissions Reduction, just an acronym, basically BAC, MAC, LAIR. These are all things saying good technology. BESR used to be Method 21, Quad OB. BESR is now OGI, another shift. Before, we were able to use Method 21 was BESR, and then as an alternative, AWP, if you met certain criteria, you could use OGI. So now in Quad OB, once again, the philosophical shift, where now BESR is OGI. As alternative, you can use Method 21. BESR is OGI according to a method called Appendix K. Too deep to go into Appendix K, but a very rigorous quality control method that will run your LDAR program as far as audits, training. I mean, it's so rigorous. As somebody who does that, it can be used for gas plants. I've told my customers that you don't want to do it yet. There's too many compliance pitfalls. But anything that's new, we have this resistance. But we'll figure it out, get SOPs together, get technology to help us, and we will be doing that. It's basically the same as previous programs, okay, except alternative to use OGI, and if you're under Quad OB, it's everything, okay? So whereas in the past we had the 10% VOC exemption, so now it's inlet to outlet. You can do a test if it's less than 0.1% using method 18, you don't have to do it. But it's just easier just to start at the inlet pig, go to your residue compressors all the way out, at least for gas plants. We also had a new section put in there for super emitters. There may have been something talked about that, but if you meet certain criteria, you can see 100 kilograms per hour. You register with the EPA and give your methodology in that, and then you can be on the list of one of the companies that can report industry when they find a super emitter. This could really be satellites, some, I guess, NGOs or just independent companies that have a mechanism could be fixed wing, things like that. We'll wait and see how this shakes out. And then the operators have so much time to actually initiate some type of response and then report within 15 days. I'm going to talk briefly on this. This was proposed about a year and a half ago as we were developing Appendix K, because Quad OB and EG Quad OC have been developing for about 3 years now. This is another shift. As we start going into the RTRs, which is the Resource Technology Review for industry and some of the upstream or midstream facilities, you can now use Appendix K. So, whereas in the past, it had always been Method 21. So the OGI and some of these advanced technologies are not just for distribution, or not just for oil and gas midstream and upstream. Now we're starting to weave our way into the oil and gas value chain. That's a total shift, which means it could progress further to refining. If you understand the history of OGI a little bit, the API, the refining industry, are the whole ones that pushed it in the mid-2000s. That's when we began. API wanted to use this. It made sense. We have 500,000 components at our refinery, 400,000, whatever it is, right, that we have to do on a periodic basis. And we're sending teams of 40 people out there every day, getting 400 to 500 done a day. They were looking for a better way to find the leaks. OGI is more efficient, so they were fighting for it. So even though they do not have it in the latest, the refinery rule, this could probably be the next transition that the refineries have a chance to do that. I do not think it will ever be for the SOCME industry, the cats and dogs and the radicals as we get outside the alkanes and alkenes. It's just, it may be a little much for a device such as an OGI camera that basically sees a carbon to hydrogen bond. But this is another shift where, we're seeing technology. Here we have a transition. As we move forward, I'll be talking about some of the methane intensity rules. This is just a transitionary slide. A lot of this development has began on a global scale. The Paris Accord, OGMP 2.0, all these things are coming from a global initiative as we start to get together from the European community, from Australia, and all the different countries. We're trying to find a way to reduce our impact to the environment. I've seen this in several places, but if you think about what's happening across the rule development and legislation, we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which is methane monetization. It tells you what you're going to be taxed. Subpart WGHGRP, or mandatory reporting, that's measurement. And then we have methane management, the ABCs, as far as Quad O, Quad OA, Quad OB. So these three separate rules or legislation are connected, and they're trying to help solve the methane puzzle. They work like that. I was around during the Clean Air Act in 1990, and I remember some of the rules and how the environmental became big. But this is the first time I saw the IRA, and I think it's section 136 where they talk about the monetary policy. And all of a sudden, a year and a half later, we got the methane rule that codified a rule that was initiated by the regulation, or excuse me, by the the law that was generated by Congress. But as we sort of back away, we sort of look at the timeline. We began Quad OB November 21. Lots happened in the last 3 years, really. You got the GHG proposed rule, which, as we step back from that, empirical data. If you gather anything from as we talk about all these rules, the gathering of empirical data is what's happening. It's going to be happening. It's mentioned in the IRA, mentioned in the GHGRP, and it's also mentioned every time we go to a talk, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, and then we had EG Quad OC, or Quad OB as well. We had the IRA revisions proposed, they're just proposed. We have the promulgation of the Quad OB, it's not in the Federal Register yet, but it's proposed. And then we had the waste emission charge, it just came out a few weeks ago. Everyone's trying to wrap their hands around that and how a calculation, but basically we're going to get taxed if you're above a certain level. The waste emission charge is a tax. It increases every year, for a few years up to 26. If you hit certain methane intensity targets based on your industry segment, if you're above that level, you're going to be taxed on an amount above that level. There are a few loopholes, exemption if you do not exceed a threshold waste emission, and there's some language for delays in permitting and things like that. And then the last one, and I don't know when it will happen, it's probably going to be 28. And as I read this, it was sort of confusing, but once everybody is under EG Quad OC, you can get an exemption from that. That is basically when the state SIPs in all 50 states are complying with EG Quad OC, you can get an exemption that's in there. So I guess that's why it stops in 26 around there, because around 28, 27, depending on when they get their SIPs ready, you'll have that exemption anyway. Understanding the scale, okay, as you start to figure out, what does this really mean? I mean, as a business person, okay, this rule, how does it impact industry? We keep increasing our natural gas, as far as our production. We got a global share. I mean, what's happening overseas, Ukraine, Russia, is changing the landscape. We got demethanization, we got decarbonization. There's so much going on. What does this really mean, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. As I started looking at it, and I have another slide here that I really want to get to. There's a way it's calculated. It's too deep to go in there. But here, from a businessman, this is what I look at. Who would actually have the possibility to be impacted by the waste emissions fee? I saw this on the website, and I'm like, wow. You can look at it, it's in the oil and gas basins, and there's a heat map on there based on color. These are the facilities that they're expected to owe a waste immunization charge. I did not see a number in there yet, but this just came out. I'm still digesting, trying to find, what's the impact. Each individual facility can get their impact, but it's going to be a pretty big impact across the oil and gas basins. We got some proposed amendments to Subpart W. Once again, I'm transitioning to Subpart W, right? It's been going through a plethora of changes since 23. Public comments, amendments adopted are going to be adopted. Then they're going to propose some more comments in relation to the Inflation Reduction Act, asking for empirical data. So we expect that to keep changing until 26. So if you read rules, your head's spinning trying to keep up with all the changes and how it may impact you as an industry or a consultant, how you can help your customer. Here I'm going to try to tie in the Venn diagram and how they might work together, okay? Quad OB, e.g. Quad OC, requires certain testing of your compressors, okay, now with the high flow sampler or determining mass. Well, the GHGRP also requires that. The GHGRP does not require the methodology used in Quad OB. You can sort of cowboy it and just go up there, take a test, get a reading, and move on, because that's not codified yet. So we don't want to do the same thing twice. So if you're doing your GHG and you're under Quad OB, pull those together and comply with one. Use the Quad OB methodology, and then use that to report for the GHG. There's no sense going out there for GHG and doing the same thing again for EG Quad OC or Quad OB. Just remember, the thing that's different in Quad OB is we never in the past required well pad reciprocating compressors to be included in it. And now if you meet the definition of a central production facility, which basically means you take a bunch of external wells and then you pipe them to a central production facility, as opposed to the production being on the well pad itself. For example, a six-pack may have 4 wells right on the pad, all fenced in. That's a well site. If you go off that centralized well pad, off into acreage, then you pipe it in there, that's a central production facility. So those would fall under the testing requirements in Quad OB. Once again, the Venn diagram. And I mentioned earlier that if you took away anything, and gathering real data as opposed to using factors is where we're going. Empirical is mentioned 41 times in the proposed GHG rule. Empirical data is mentioned 27 times. It's mentioned 3 times in sections 136 of the Inflation Reduction Act. That's how they work together. The Inflation Reduction Act is mentioned 13 times in the proposed GHGRP. Waste emissions is mentioned 25 times in the proposed GHGRP. And vice versa, GHGRP is mentioned 26 times in the waste emissions rule. And on and on and on. So these 3 rules reference each other and work together. What we're meaning out of these most recent rules is they work together, and you will be gathering empirical data. So if you put your little crystal ball out there and thought about what is the next step, and they mention it all through there. No more factors. If you're going to pay a tax on it, whether it's codified or whether it makes sense for you as a business person to spend the money to get better factors so you can reduce your methane tax, empirical data is going to happen in the next few years, if not sooner. Some of the big takeaways for the annual testing of compressors, they changed the modes. Whereas past, you had to test in the downtime mode, you had to test in not operating depressurized mode, so you have that criteria. Now, which for 10 years, we've had to shut down a compressor to go out there and test, stop production. And so they changed it. You no longer have to do that. It's true as found condition. And they included a standby mode to include rod packing vents. So if you do some GHG testing in the future, there's a few little subtle changes. You want to make sure that you know that part. In the past, we didn't have to do rod packing measurements if you were in the standby pressurized mode. Winding down here, empirical data is paramount. Overall, we have frequent required AVO and more frequent OGI for oil and gas upstream, taking inspections to cradle and grave. That means there's a closure requirement in Quad OB and EG Quad OC. You still keep doing it until you meet the closure requirements, almost similar to cement plugging it. The flexibility to use periodic or continuous options. We have a super emitter rule. We'll see how this shakes out and who actually reports. We're looking at rod packing vents, doing your rod packing vents annually, using a high flow sampler or some equivalent device. The other thing is for natural gas processing plants, or NGPP, the acronym I use there. Appendix K is now BESSER, not Method 21. The biggest thing moving forward, if you're going to use OGI, Appendix K is the Achilles heel that will cause compliance pitfalls. If you're going to use OGI and you're in the midstream or upstream, make sure you understand how you have to comply with that. And starting in 28, maybe 27, there'll be over 1 million oil and gas sites that are required to do OGI. as per Google, or it's got a whole lot. So it's an incredible task that our industry has to face in the near future. And it's a great thing because we want to keep it in the pipe, but we have to figure out how to do it economically.
Roy, great presentation. Thank you for coming up and speaking, and I always learn something. In your opinion, how do you feel that the industry is going to manage this interwoven, detailed stack and layered stack of regulations on top of each other? Do you think that they're going to have to kind of do like a boilerplate, like okay, just kind of, if one thing, I guess you can't just, if you have all these facilities subject to all these different regulations, you can't, it's going to be very hard to say, okay, this is a Quad OB facility, or this is Quad OA, this is EGC, or, do you think that it'll just be, how do you think the industry will probably approach that?
I say this jokingly, but spend a lot of money.
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to need resources. You're going to need database, big data. I mean, we've got to have a way to manage this program and getting the fields, the proper fields gathered, so that way, when you use your emisses, okay, you can pull that data and show compliance not only with the regulations, reporting requirements. Let's think about the SEC rule coming down the road and some of the other stuff, the ability to report and gather that data from what I'll call a clearinghouse. So preparing for the data. I mean, we're going to have more environmental people. We're going to have more inspection. You're going to have to, anything that time there's a new rule, consultants make a killing helping you out. And then you weave off, or you cut the umbilical cord, and then you have these systems for yourself. So it's just a whole lot. I mean, it's all happening in the last few years. So just money.
Thank you, Roy. Joe Morrill from Sensors. Simple question. Did I read correctly that if the states, I know you didn't speak to the states' plans, but if they do not engage a plan in the next 24 months, that the EPA will force Quad OB upon them? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you don't, it's so hard to hit every little detail and not have y'all fall asleep on me when we're talking about regulations, right? But the SIP process is you can incorporate your state SIP by reference, e.g. Quad OC, or you can do your own. It has to be at least as stringent as the federal SIP, which is that's what e.g. Quad OC is. And if you don't do it by a certain date and apply, your SIP is e.g. Quad OC. So it will be implemented. There's hammer times. You can make it more stringent, or just, say incorporate by reference, take the easy path. Colorado, California, Pennsylvania, probably going to be more stringent. New Mexico. Some others, I would think they're just going to incorporate it by reference.
Thanks, Roy. And one more question, too, particularly kind of applying to the distribution sector for Subpart W and the proposed amendments. One of the challenges that I've seen, especially on the utility side, is the gate stations are subject to, Subpart W surveys, a sampling of your gate stations every year. Now with the proposed amendments, they're increasing the emission factors if you use OGI. And so you're seeing a lot of more industry shift towards quantification, using EPA methods, direct measurement methods. But one of the challenges is that they're saying you have to have, is it 50 components that, if say you have 5 component emission factors, you got connectors, valves, flanges, but do you have to have a sampling of 50 before you can create create your own company-specific emission factor? Do you know that?
Actually, I haven't seen that.
Okay, because I've heard some people are saying you have to do like a sampling of 50 connectors, for example. You would have to quantify 50 connectors, but I was saying if
there's
you don't,
usually in previous EPA documents, there's a statistical criteria where you evaluate the scatter of your data, and that scatter, we remember, but
yeah.
David will remember. So usually how's your correlation
Yeah.
and scatter of the data would be the most statistical approach rather than some random number of 50. It maybe will be accomplished in 5 to 20.
That's more
Or it
reasonable.
could be more if your scatter is huge, but if you're gathering a bunch of data and it seems to agree, your correlation coefficient would be higher and would be more representative. So I'll look into that. I mean, these are all new. It's tough to be an expert on every little thing.
I think that the frustration is you have only so much above ground equipment in a transfer, a gate station. And so it's hard to find 50 connectors leaking in a year to develop that emission factor. But if it was a more reasonable number, that they'll allow for that empirical data, that would be a better way, I think, because you can't just cookie cutter everything so much,
And the thing about factors, and I'll finish up with that, is when an independent company is looking for developing factors, I did this when I cut my teeth in a career in the early 90s, developing some of the correlation and factors for unit-specific correlations for the data out of the R53 document. I actually did the field work when I cut my teeth. It's biased unless you're random. You could have that individual person pick low leaks, right? Because if you have a population, so there needs to be some criteria for randomness, or else the human propensity to make that decision would be a bias. So as we develop these factors, I think there should be a methodology, that if we find 50 leaks, do a random number generator, pick those leaks, do 10 or something like that. Anyway.
Real quick, where does underground storage come in, the regulations for injection and removal wells? And because a lot of the distribution government do have storage too, underground storage.
In the federal rules, that's not, I have never done any except for state rules, that may apply to a state rule. The underground storage, as far as the OGI, I do not see it in Quad OB. Okay, it's in GHG for as far as developing factors or doing some testing, but I haven't seen it in Quad OB yet.
Okay.
So you make me question it now. These are new rules. Have you seen it?
Yeah. Well, I know a lot of distribution now, do storage field inspections.
Yeah.
But a lot of them are mobile application. They're ATV mounted. They go to the wells, individually and test the wells, and then they'll do the fields too with mobile.
I do a lot of CO2 injection, same type of thing, above a salt dome or something like that.
Yeah.
But that's production. The storage segment really isn't part of the federal rule,
Right.
EB,
Okay.
Quad OB and EG Quad OC. Thank you.